So, welcome to week 3 of How to Teach with Buddha Dharma University, and we are going to be taking a look this week at planning a lesson. So, if you have done some of the reading and stuff already, you have seen that activating strategy is part of what we do in planning a lesson. So, for activating today, I'm going to ask you to think about the type of group or learning group information session that you see yourself leading. So in order to kind of think about this, if you don't already lead a group, you might want to go back to your week 1 work to refresh your memory about what it is that you said you think that you might be doing in the capacity as a priest. And take a moment to pause this video right now to think about, to write out or type out your answer to this question. So what are the key terms or concepts that participants in your group would need to know in order to comfortably participate, to comfortably learn the material that you are delivering in your lesson? So this might be key words, key terms, jargon, etc. that you would use in your instruction. So pause the video here and write down the list of words that you think that your students, the participants in your learning groups, would need to know, to understand. So once you've done that, we can go on to talking about what a lesson plan is. So a lesson plan, what is it? So before we start talking about what a lesson plan is, we really kind of want to know what a lesson is. So a lesson, the definition, is a structured period of time where a teacher teaches about a subject or how to perform an activity. Now, one of the things that I misunderstood early on in my years as a teacher was that a lesson had to take place over one session. So what I did in one period or one block of teaching, in my mind, was the lesson. Thankfully, I learned that a lesson is actually something that can take place over several sessions. Okay, so it's not necessarily done in just one session that you lead. So if you are doing a book study, for example, and you need to talk about a concept that is presented, you can take multiple sessions to cover that concept, and it is considered one lesson. So that's just something that's important to understand. So it's not, you don't have to cram a bunch of information into one session. You can split it up. It can take some time to go over it. So now we can talk about what a lesson plan is. Now that we understand what a lesson is, we can talk about what a lesson plan is. So simply put, a lesson plan is an organizational tool that an instructor uses to help them structure a lesson. And this tool allows us to focus in on the important points that need to be made in given a lesson, or in a given lesson, or in a session that you might lead. Okay, and there are many types of lesson plans, and I will, let me get to our link here. So I wanted to show you an example of what a lesson plan can look like. So the lesson plans that I developed for this course look like this, and this is based on a very simplified version of a lesson plan that I would use for developing my course as a public school teacher. So for BDU, we don't need quite the pieces and parts because we're lucky. We don't have standardized tests or state standards to respond to. So I was able to very much simplify my lesson plan to include the different components that are really essential for us. So things like prior knowledge, learning objectives, keywords. And for week 1, you can see there, I gave that first week's lesson a title, which is important because it helps us focus in on the key concepts that we're talking about. Our key words, such as backward design, activating strategy, activities that I had you do, the resource and materials that I used, and the assessment that I used to make sure that you were able to understand the lesson and the idea of what ultimate why is. So this is what a lesson plan can potentially look like. Now, for for your purposes or our purposes as priests, we may not necessarily always need to have a formal lesson plan, but I am going to ask you this week to create one just so that you can go through the process and see that it really is a process that helps you consider carefully all the different elements and steps that your students have to become familiar with in order to perform a task, in order to learn a skill, in order to absorb information. The lesson plan really kind of helps us break down that process and then helps us understand, okay, these are the things that my students, you won't be working with kids most likely. I think about it as kids. This is the stuff that my kids are going to need. You will think about it in terms of this is the stuff that my participants in my learning group are going to need. So part of what we are going to be looking at is that concept of scaffolding. And if you are familiar with the word scaffold, you know that it's a structure that we build around a building, or maybe it's outside or inside a building, and it helps us kind of climb up to the different higher up places that we need to reach in order to do renovation or restoration work or repairs. And the idea of scaffolding in education is really this idea of giving students the opportunity to receive guided practice of the components that are needed to perform a particular skill. It's important because it allows the instructors to see what parts of the skill a student might need to work on before moving on to performing the entire skill. So it helps us break down our lesson when we think about scaffolding. And it provides students with the best opportunity for success in executing the skill that is going to be practiced when we allow them to scaffold. So I love the example of guided meditations as being a great example to help beginning meditators develop the skill of eventually independently meditating. So I know that when I first started meditation practice, I didn't have to, but I chose to attend sessions of guided meditations. And those were helpful because it broke down, it scaffolded the skills for me of how to sit, how to breathe, where to focus my attention. And every once in a while, the instructor, who happens to now be my guiding teacher, would break in with reminders to refocus, to reposition, to bring ourselves back and not get caught up. And it was a great way to start that meditation practice. The longer you practice, the less you need those guided meditations, and you might move on to guided meditations that have longer pauses between the reminders, until eventually you are meditating on your own without the use of guided meditations. So that's a great example of how scaffolding works in teaching people how to perform a certain skill. And it is something that we use in public education as well. So, okay, this is doing something very strange, and I apologize. All right, so I'm going to get out of this view here. Here we go. We want this slide. So we want to take a look at the steps of scaffolding. So okay, technology. Okay, we're just gonna go with this. So here are the steps in scaffolding. I had fancy animations in there, but we're letting that go. So our steps in scaffolding, this is presented to you in one of the articles that I had you read. So in order to scaffold a lesson, there are some things to take a look at, some steps that you want to remember that we are taking. So the ultimate goal, you can see at the very end, our ultimate goal is to allow the participants in our learning groups to continue building on content or a skill or a concept. You as an instructor will continue to give feedback, but eventually the idea is that your learners will move on to be able to perform those skills independently, and then you are going to build on to those skills. So our first step, however, is to determine what students already know. So we talked about getting to know your students. What are they coming in already knowing? And that we call that prior knowledge. So what prior knowledge do your students have as they enter into a classroom, a learning group? And for myself, I always, part of the questionnaire that I ask my students at the beginning of a semester is, do you speak any other languages? That prior knowledge is a valuable one, because that means if they speak more than one language, they've already gone through the process of learning another language. That helps them, that serves as a tool for them to be able to refer back to. If they know another language like Spanish, which can be very close to French, I know that I can point to them, hey, this is how this happens in Spanish. It happens the same way in French. So understanding what a student comes in already knowing really can help you help them. And it also helps you scaffold lesson in a particular way. The next step you want to go for is setting a goal for learning. So what are the learning outcomes that you want to set for students? What learning outcomes are reasonable to expect? Your third step is to plan instructional supports, or how skills or strategies can be broken down. So before I can ask my students to count to 10 in French, I want to break down things like, how do you pronounce a vowel in French? Because when they see a number spelled out, they don't necessarily know how to sound that out, and they don't necessarily know that the way it looks is going to sound different than what they expect, because the letters sound different in French than they do in English. Little slight differences, but important ones that affect processing. So before I teach them how to count, part of my lesson includes, this is how you pronounce each of the letters, and this is how you put them together. So breaking down the skill. You will follow similar steps when establishing a lesson for your learners. The next step is implementing your lessons and monitoring progress. So formative assessments, which we'll talk about in a future lesson, but you will have lessons, you will walk your students through those lessons, and you will monitor their progress. This is the fifth step. So you are going to, over time, fade support. So you're going to pull back the support. You're not going to be holding their hands so much. So this is the step in guided meditation where we are lengthening the time between reminders to refocus. Okay, so instead of offering them 2 minutes, we're maybe lengthening the reminder period to 4 minutes. So you're fading your support over time. So that students can try out on their own, becoming successful independently in that practice of that skill. And like we said, that last step is continuing to build on that skill so that students can become stronger in what they do. So we are going to come to prior knowledge. So I just mentioned this. We've it is what it sounds like. It's just, what do your students know when they come in, when they begin the lesson? And often it is knowledge that is acquired in previous lessons that they have received from you. Or if they are starting brand new with you, chances are good that some of them will have taken other courses or attended other learning sessions of some kind and are coming in with some information already. What do they know? What do they remember? And then you would ask yourself, what do my students know that we can build on? So if it is lesson number 2 in a series of 8, what do I know you know? What information do I know you have acquired? And how am I going to build on that? So our next thing is our keywords. So this is the list that I asked you to come up with at the beginning of this lesson. So keywords are important. So this is the list of words that you came up with, like I said at the beginning of this video. They're always terms that we use that we ask participants to become familiar with so that they are able to process the information in a lesson. They need to be familiar with it in order to be able to understand a concept. So, for example, my list of keywords for this lesson is at the bottom of the screen. So lesson plan, scaffolding, prior knowledge, keywords, activation strategy. So in order to really know how to put together a lesson plan, you needed to know the definition of a lesson, which I provided. You need to know how to scaffold. You need to know what your students are coming in with. You need to know what their prior knowledge is. You need to know keywords, and you need to know what an activation strategy is. And those things will help you be able to pull together a lesson plan. Understanding what those terms are, what those elements are of a lesson plan, helps you form an effective lesson plan. So that's what a keyword is. The words that you need in order to be able to understand a concept. So an activation strategy. So you've seen me use this already a couple of times. And basically, it's how you're going to kick off your lesson. How are you going to pique this interest? So they can be questions that you ask at the beginning of a lesson. Like the one I asked you, those questions or that question helped you kind of go, okay, why do I need to think about this? What is this about? Or if you've already read some of the article, you're like, oh, I wonder if this is keywords, right? So there are things that kind of get you thinking on the topic that we're going to be talking about, or an element of the topic that we're going to be working on in a lesson. Activation strategies can be anything like questions. Sometimes they're articles to read or videos to watch if we're in an online context. It's any kind of activity that begins the inquiry process, and it's an important step for students, but it's also a helpful one when we're talking about adult learners, because it kind of gets us thinking, oh, it builds our curiosity, right? Oh, what is this? Why are we doing this? How does this fit in with what we're doing? How does this fit in with what we talked about last week, right? So it's really a way to kind of get that curiosity going, piquing interest of the students, and it really helps get the juices flowing, as they say. So those are the elements of a lesson plan. So for this week, the quiz that you are going to complete will help you build a lesson plan. So I will walk you through, what is your activation strategy, or what is the prior knowledge? What, in the context of the learning group that you are going to run, think of a lesson that you think that you would need to teach. And what are the different elements? So I'm going to ask you to really kind of process all of these different parts of a lesson plan and go through the steps of really giving careful consideration for all the different elements in a lesson that you would offer in your learning group. I suggest that you copy paste some of your responses into a Google Doc or into a Word document so that you can keep track of your own lesson plan that you are going to create. If you would like a template to be able to plug this information into, I am happy to share the one that I showed you earlier, the lesson plan template that I used for building this BDU course. So if you would like that template, please just send me an email, and it is in a Google Doc, so I can send you a link that will force you to make a copy of that so that you can plug your answers into a lesson plan template. That way you have an example. So if you never create another lesson plan again, that's fine. Hopefully going through this process, though, helps build that, more introspective approach or considered approach to presenting information to your learning groups. So if you never make another lesson plan again, that's great. But if you find this tool particularly helpful, it might be something that you can use again and again if you have this template to have as a starting point. So feel free to send me an email if you would like a copy of that, and I'd be happy to share it with you. So that wraps up this week's lecture. I am looking forward to working with you again week 4.